So I'd like to hand over the floor to Lola Young this evening. Please make your 10-minute contribution on that theme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inderjeet, and thanks to everybody for welcoming me into your club and homes and whatever in this rather strange predicament in which we find ourselves. Yes, Black History Month, a very interesting subject as far as I'm concerned. There's a level on which I would want to argue that we shouldn't have to have it, but we do. And that is due in no small part to what Stuart Hall, the late great Professor Stuart Hall, used to call historical amnesia. And that refers to the ways in which Britain, in very many different ways, has managed to kind of forget or obliterate or omit or diminish the impact and contributions that people of African descent, and indeed from many other cultures and nationalities, the contribution that those people have made to the development and the formation of what we consider to be Britain today. Black History Month in this country started in 1987, which is coincidental with the election of Diane Abbott, Paul Boateng, Bernie Grant and Keith Faz as MPs. And those four MPs had a big impact in Parliament. And in the time since then, 87 and now, the number of so-called ethnic minority MPs and indeed peers has grown quite significantly. Black History Month, though, I must say that for some time I couldn't quite find myself wanting to engage with it because it seemed to have a minimal historical content. And I think that was because it was kind of hijacked by local authorities and community centres and so on as a way of showing how they would wish to celebrate diversity in one form or another. So in fact, the emphasis was for a little while, I think, on just a general sense of, oh, isn't it nice to have these people amongst us? And yes, they've been here since the Windrush, and that's all very fine and dandy, and let's celebrate that. But in fact, the historical content was small because there was so little that was generally known at that particular time. For me, it was 1984, so just a few years before that, when Peter Fryer's book Staying Power was published, that then indicated that the breadth and the depth of Black people's presence in this country going back then, as he wrote, going back to Roman times, so some 2,000 and odd years. And in fact, more recent research is throwing up more and more instances and evidence of the presence of Black people in Britain across the country. And indeed in other countries of Britain as well. So Wales, Ireland, Scotland, all involved in that history. So then there was a bit of an evolution that then began to take on board. Yes, there's the whole Windrush thing, to which I'm sure we'll return at some point. But there was also, you know, these odd instances of people like Mary Seacole, for example, who was flagged up. And then as more people got to know about her, that became quite an interesting terrain on which there was a kind of contest, as it were. It was represented as some kind of contest between the significance of Mary Seacole and the significance of Florence Nightingale, and they were contemporaries, as I'm sure you know. So that became sort of played out in the media to some extent, and I would argue that those kinds of tensions, or what are perceived to be tensions about the presence of Black people, about what we've done and about who represents that history, have continued to be played out in one way or another since 1987. Today, though, I was quite pleasantly surprised, I guess, by the number of organisations and companies and businesses that thought it appropriate to say, yes, we stand up and celebrate Black History Month. And that is interesting because, of course, in this particular year in which so much has happened that has had a particularly relevant to the circumstances in which many Black people find themselves, not just here, but also, of course, in the USA. What has happened there and here and elsewhere has really shone a light on this idea about Black people's presence here in this country. And of course, that has been mainly, but not exclusively, figured through this very difficult, tense, contradictory, contested space, which is colonialism, and how each of us as Black people of African descent, indeed of people of Asian descent, of people of white British descent, how does that period of history impact upon our relations today? And so one of the reasons why I think Black history is important is that I don't feel we can actually address in any deep and meaningful way the problem of racism and how to combat it and how white people can be allies in eliminating it. We can't address that in any meaningful way until we've addressed what has happened in the past. And the first step towards addressing that is, of course, acknowledging that that past existed. A number of people I've spoken to who are saying that their children in schools today are still not being told about imperialism, colonialism, the enslavement of millions of Africans. And that is kind of a willful, almost, ignorance that is being imposed on our children and has been imposed on us in the past. As I said, you know, as a now sort of quite ancient person, I recall in school being taught about the history of Britain through the pink bits on the map. You know, that was what the history of Britain was about. And there was a little bit of mention of the colonies, you know, rubber from Malaysia, cocoa from Ghana, and that was about it. So how can we have a proper appreciation of what happened during those centuries of colonial rule, and indeed the aftermath of that, what that has led to? How can we have a really good conversation about that if we're also ignorant about it? And that ignorance was highlighted very much, I think, in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protests in the USA, when that was interpreted over here partly as the toppling of statues. What an interesting, well, it's interesting as a metaphor, but it's also interesting as a reality. So those statues that have stood there for all those years, and some people have barely questioned their presence. Some people barely know who they are, or know and understand what their names are. But the fact that those statues are there, the fact that in our street names like Jamaica Street or Black Boy Lane or Pretoria Road, that history is unavoidable in one sense because it's inscribed in the landscape all around us. But as I say, the real problem is that we haven't been able to recognize that in any kind of legitimate way through history books. And more recently, perhaps some television programs have begun to look at that era. But by and large, that's been a very, very difficult and contentious history that people have not really wanted to address because somehow we don't have the language for it. We don't have a way of making a safe place where we can address those issues. So the importance of Black History Month for me is that it should be able to enable us to have those conversations, to throw up some of the tensions, the contradictions, and not only in that colonial history, but what preceded that, both here and in Africa, because contrary to some people's perceptions, there was such a thing as pre-colonial African civilization. And so, you know, we need that sense of that history and that exchange of culture, that exchange of ideas, the exchange of knowledge that has gone on for centuries. It was interesting when I was doing a little bit of research for an essay I'd just written on this subject for the House magazine in Parliament, and trying to think about the examples where some of these characters have been hidden in plain sight. So Pablo Franquez from the Beatles song For the Benefit of Mr. Kite was one example. And there are many other examples too of names of individuals and communities that have been here since way before Windrush. So I'm not quite sure where I am time-wise, but I think I would want to sort of finish by saying that there is an opportunity here, both through what's happened with Black Lives Matters and also with what we've been trying to do, particularly more recently with Black History Month. There's a real opportunity to understand and to articulate what constitutes a really shared history. And that's what we should be aiming for in order that we can move forward and begin a real kind of elimination, or at least a diminution of racism in this country and beyond. Thank you.
And we'll come back to Q&A for members. Please have them ready once Yasmin has stopped speaking this evening. And can I also invite the audience at the club also to have any questions ready that you may wish to ask, because I will invite you to come over to the lectern to ask the questions so everybody can hear you online as well. Just to give you a tally, we've got about 25 people online, and you've seen the number of people. There's about 15 people here in the room itself. So Yasmin, without further ado, can I welcome you again and invite you for your contribution this evening?
Thank you, and thank you, Lola. Very succinct and very important observations. I want to start with a quote from a seminal book that probably changed my life, and that is The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And there's a letter in there. If you haven't read it, it's a thin book, but it is so profound and so beautiful and so important, and was written decades ago, that I really would recommend you read it. And here's this quote: there's no reason for you to try and become like white people, and there's no basis whatsoever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible, and this is the best part, this is the part, the really terrible thing, oh buddy, is that you must accept them, and you must accept them with love, for they are in effect still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And I think that's incredibly important, because Black History Month is as much about white and brown people as much as it is about Black Britons and actually Black people around the world. It's trying to, we are all trapped in our histories. And most of us, most societies, most civilizations are very, it's like a comfort blanket. And most societies like to have the best spin on their history. Nobody likes to accept or find out or know all the bad stuff they did. They just want the glory. And I think there are only 2 countries in the world which have dared to break this pattern, and one is Germany and one is South Africa. Incredibly painful though it's been, they addressed their difficult, tragic, violent histories. South Africa, almost from the time it became independent and the Truth and Reconciliation process was set up. Germany, after the Second World War, their children and their grandchildren were taught things about what their country did. And as a result, I think young Germans in general, I know there's the re-emergence of a neo-fascism in Germany and Austria, but reckoning properly with history has given their younger populations a way forward. They're not trapped in a history they don't understand. So I think we need to look at it in that way. And of course, it's not just white people. I was born and raised in Uganda when Uganda was a colony. And I'm at the moment writing an article about how East African Asians treated Black Africans. We were absolutely racist, and we still are. And we have had to, we aren't making the effort we need to make to unlearn that. There is a problem of colorism in our societies, which goes back to the caste system. And then the colonialism kind of validated that. And most colonial societies had whites at the top, browns in the middle, and blacks at the bottom. So unlearning history, it seems to me, is very important. I think one of the most, I didn't know until Lola said when Black History Month started. I didn't realize it was when Diane and the other 3 Black MPs entered Parliament. But that also reminded me of terminology. Of course, I have always described myself as Black, politically Black. I will never be anything other than that. I may be, of course, I'm of Asian background, African roots. I'm a Muslim, I'm a woman, all of that. But politically, I'm completely Black, which is why James Baldwin is my, if you like, torch in life, okay? But of course, we've now entered a different phase through the years where exactly the same systems that prevailed during the age of colonialism and imperialism has been transported here in terms of identity politics. So now the identities have narrowed and narrowed, and the political fights are solipsistic. So Muslims are fighting for Muslims, and Hindus are fighting for Hindus, and so on and so on. And actually that just allows the power structures to carry on doing what they do. I think we need to, I watched on Sky News last week, Sky Arts last week, a program on Rock Against Racism. If you haven't seen it, please do. This was my political period, probably Lola's too, when every color got together in this country to fight against the National Front. And it's a wonderful film, a reminder of what we did what we could do when we got together. So for me, Black History Month represents the challenge of how the past still infects the present. And it should be a way of bringing us together. And I think Lola's right that at the moment, and I think partly because of Black Lives Matter, it was wonderful to see Sainsbury's tweeting its support for Black History Month. I've never seen that happen before, and so on. And one of the things I think that is it's not just to address the untold history, and I agree with Lola that Staying Power was such a groundbreaking, incredibly well-researched Black history book. But of course, Peter Fryer restricted it because, there's so much there to people of African heritage, Black heritage. Rosina Visram wrote her history books on Asians in Britain for similar reasons. And her books are also phenomenally important. And what that did was, it didn't just say, here is a history we didn't know. It also said, there's been suppression of this history. So even as recently as the end of the First World War, near Brighton, some of you will know this, if you do, forgive me for retelling this story. Some of you might not, but there's a wonderful memorial in the South Downs near Brighton, which is called the Chhatri Memorial. It's shaped like an umbrella. And it is a monument to Indian soldiers who fought with Britain in the First World War. And it's a wonderful thank you, actually, from the I think it was the Prince Regent and this nation to those soldiers. If you go to Monte Cassino, there are monuments in Italy. There are monuments to Indian soldiers over there, again, acknowledging the tribute. Those monuments were there. Mary Seacole, when she was actually in the Crimea, the Times, I've forgotten the name of the reporter, every week reported on what this woman was doing for the soldiers. When she came here, the soldiers and some of the most powerful people in this country had grand celebrations for this Black healer who had gone to Crimea off her own bat because she wasn't officially allowed because she was Black. So we knew, but it was known and it was suppressed. And I want us to ask, what makes nations want to suppress histories? Why do they do that? This is happening in India at the moment with Mughal history, because there's a kind of Hinduization of that country, very diverse country. And again, certain histories are being suppressed. So I think for us, Black History Month, and this time particularly because of Black Lives Matter, has assumed a vitality and an urgency and an importance which has been taken up by a lot more people than I think ever was. I mean, the whole story, again, of talking about suppressed histories, it was only in 1982 that two librarians in Brent called Ziggy Alexander and Audrey Devji kind of disinterred the story of Mary Seacole. I did a talk recently with the Calypso Society of Britain on a man it's not even that historical, but it just shows it continues to happen. There was a fantastic character called Lord Woodbine in Liverpool. I wonder how many people here know Lord Woodbine. Can you, those actually in the club, can you put your hand up if you have heard of Lord Woodbine? Okay, Lord Woodbine was a Trinidadian who actually started off the Beatles. When the Beatles began, he was a musician in Liverpool who called himself Lord Woodbine because he smoked Woodbine cigarettes. And the Beatles, who were absolutely into music, went to the clubs where he was playing, they were known as Woodbine's Chicks, the four of them. They would follow him and he would teach them. And he took them to Hamburg, that moment of breakthrough. He hired the van, he took them. And there's a wonderful photo of him with the Beatles and with one or two other managers in Hamburg. And guess what? He was written out of the story of the Beatles. And I find that so shocking that we're talking about here and now, okay? He died in a horrible fire. And I wrote an article about him with a wonderful PhD, actually he's now got his doctorate, James McGrath, I think he was called. We co-wrote an article on Lord Woodbine, another forgotten. So history is being made and forgotten even as we speak. And that cannot be right, cannot be something any of us would be proud of. We're also entering an age, as Lola said, of contested narratives. Again, there was a time, I think I really am not being an old woman who thinks the past was glorious and the present terrible. I don't believe that. But I think there was a time when the curriculum was opening up, when at least we were telling the stories of the two world wars and all the soldiers who fought in it. We had the monument in the Mall. People were listening. Education was expanding, the way he thought about science, history, and so on. We've now entered a different period, and we have a Black education minister who last week got up and more or less said that you cannot, I can't remember her exact words, but you will find her online, that it is illegal to decolonize the curriculum or something, that the curriculum stands as it is and it is illegal to touch it. How can you live in a free society and not constantly be assessing knowledge? So we're in a very interesting time. So it's taken as unpatriotic if you say Churchill was a great war leader, which he was. Churchill was also incredibly racist towards Indians, which he was. Those facts are not mutually exclusive. We need to know the whole person. The British brought railways. True. They also were responsible, and that was partly Churchill, for a famine which killed 3 million people. There's never been a famine in India after the British left. This is a fact. So I think the resistance, the contestation, the new, if you like, obscurantism is what Black Lives Matter is also very, very, very gently addressing. And I think we should be very grateful to the people who brought it in, because knowledge deficit of any kind is no good to anyone. Remember what James Baldwin said. And in the book, in my new book, what I've done is try to tell some of those stories. It's 50 stories of Black, white, brown women, all of whom have done what they did to progress the rights of women in this country. The first woman ever to be allowed to study law was Indian. Mary Seacole is in the book. Renieda Lodge, who's a young Black woman writer who absolutely blows me away with her confidence and her knowledge. And also the female abolitionists who were written out by Wilberforce himself and his mates. So I think Black History Month is much more than just reinstating or, as Lola said, kind of celebrating. It is a real challenge to what nations love to do, which is to control knowledge and to rewrite history, science, whatever. And I think we should make Black History Month, because of Black Lives Matter, an even bigger thing next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Yasmin. A lot of food for thought, and particularly your kind of contribution in the latest book that you've published. And I really look forward to reading that, particularly some of the people that you've mentioned have been very close to my heart, and I like to see how you presented them. I wanted to sort of pick up on Lord Woodbine, really. I mean, airbrushing people out of history. We do it so well. I mean, I was in conversation with Lola the other day. We were talking about how House of Commons has been sending stuff on the social media, in particular on LinkedIn. They presented the 4 MPs that were elected in 1987, the Gang of 4, Diane Abbott, Bernie Grant, Paul Boateng, and Keith Vaz. And the picture did not have Keith Vaz that they sent out on social media. And I asked the question to them very clearly. I said, this is a very recent Black British history of this country. Who has actually authorized that you can actually basically wipe out Keith Vaz out of this picture? I did not mention his name, but I basically asked the question, but I'm still waiting for a response. It's also quite revealing. You mentioned the Shatri in Brighton. That's a monument that's existed for a while, but however, there's never been a national monument to the soldiers who served in the First and the Second World War for the Empire and the Commonwealth. And I think it took a number of people in 2002 to collaborate and come together to raise the funding to put up something in this country, and that's on Constitution Hill, which I've had the privilege of chairing for the last 5 years. And it just shows you that unless we put up sort of our own history, it won't be mainstreamed, it won't be recognized. And I totally agree with both yourselves' analysis on this, which is there's a revisionism going on. And for the life of me, I also despair when I hear the sort of remarks that were made by a government minister standing at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. And not to forget that there are also 3 people of colour in the cabinet with prominent positions in government at the moment. And the final thing I'll just, and I'll then invite audience to ask the questions, is around people who challenge the history. I mean, somebody called Lawrence Fox comes to mind, and the earring that he had at Question Time, and all the debacle that's followed ever since, where we are being challenged on our own history by people then plead ignorance once they are challenged. So, you know, I totally get that. And there's loads of other questions, comments I can continue to make here, but this is not an event just for 3 of us. So can I invite the first speaker to ask their question? Sorry, even a member to ask a question rather than a speaker to our speakers. Alexander, are you online? Can you mute yourself and ask your question, please, Alex? The first question is always a little tricky. Just bear with us.
Hello.
Could I just?
No? Oh, sorry.
Alexander, the floor is yours. What's your question, please?
So, firstly, I would like to thank you for joining us today, because it was really inspiring, and I really learned a lot. And I would like to ask the question, like, what we as individuals should do on a daily basis to positively contribute to this matter. Is accepting and understanding our history enough, or should we do something more?
Lola, Yasmin, feel free to respond to that.
Shall I jump in just very quickly? But first of all, can I say just thanks to Yasmin, because it's really, really good to hear all of that, particularly from somebody I think was kind of similar vintage, shall I say, and therefore those kinds of experiences that you talked about absolutely resonated with me. And thank you for this question. I think I saw it on the chat as well. I think the understanding and acceptance of history is a step, and one might say it's maybe it's a kind of it's a first step, but it depends on you and the context within which you work, socialize, and so on and so forth. But I do think that there were some interesting things that happened around the peak moment of Black Lives Matter. And one of those things was that my son in particular reported being asked by a number of his white friends questions about some of the things they might have said in the past that they hadn't understood to be racist perhaps, but now they're kind of reevaluating what they've said and the kinds of things that they've been silent about. So for me, one of the important things is how you become an ally in this struggle, if I can use that terminology. If you're not a Black person or if you're not a brown person, how do you become an ally in that particular fight that we're engaged in? And I think knowledge and understanding is a huge part of that, albeit not the entirety of that. But it is also trying to develop the kind of consciousness that enables you to feel comfortable having discussions with a variety of people about their experiences, understanding what those microaggressions might mean for those people who are experiencing them, and supporting them and being an ally for them. Sometimes it's really difficult, and I'm not suggesting anybody should put themselves in any danger in order to do that, but I think there is a role to be played by being a good friend, and by trying to combat some of these stereotypes and other comments that will be made either in the workplace or in social circumstances. That's it.
I would also add that one way you can help, besides what Lola has suggested, is be our allies on social media. Some of us who stick our necks up are so appallingly and relentlessly attacked that it feels like a very lonely and frightening place. So somebody like you if you see online Diane Abbott or any one of us being attacked, please defend us, be on our side. That way we feel that we have got a circle of good people who are with us, because too often it's left to us to do the fight back. And many of us are now incapable of doing that because the onslaught is relentless. And I think that's just so important. And I would really humbly request that from all of you.
Here, I support you in that, Yasmin, particularly the sort of nastiness that you experience, which is beyond belief. Can I just say, well, Lola mentioned the allies that we need to have in this struggle to enrich our societies. I don't know if you can see this. Tamas, can you put the camera on? This is an article I'm holding up. Just bear with us for a second. This is an article that's appeared in the Evening Standard tonight, and that is one of the royal princes, basically saying, being interviewed by the GQ magazine, living a day in my wife's shoes taught me about race bias. I think you're also a contributor, Yasmin, to this newspaper. You may have a view on that. But can I invite Rupert, because he's got a question that he wants to ask, and then Nicola, be prepared for your question online thereafter. Thank you.
Hello, mine was a very quick question to Lola. I just missed the reference. You both mentioned the Beatles at one point, but Lola, you mentioned Mr. Kite, for the benefit of Mr. Kite, and you mentioned someone called Pablo, and I just wondered if I just missed the full explanation. Could you explain who Mr. Kite was, who Pablo was?
Thank you for that question. And I did think when Yasmin started talking about the Beatles, I thought it was a really interesting, if we can put these two stories together, it does kind of give quite an interesting little picture there that again isn't sort of in mainstream history, as it were. So there's a song called For the Benefit of Mr. Kite, which was on the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and I won't sing it for you, but the verse goes something like, for the benefit of Mr. Kite, there will be a show tonight on Trampoline. The Hendersons will all be there, late of Pablo Fanque's fair. So Pablo Fanque's, F-A-N-Q-U-E-S, was a circus proprietor. His real name was William Darby. He was born in, well, it's contested, I think 1796 or 1801, but around the turn of the 19th century. And both of his parents were Africans living in Norwich. So he was born in late 18th century, early 19th century in Norwich, an African man who ran a circus. He owned a circus, and it was one of the most popular circuses in the country for about 30 years. So all of that is documented. And again, it's kind of interesting about how that has been hidden from sight. And the Beatles, apparently, again, there's a bit of contestation here. Was it John or was it Paul who I think John bought the poster which advertised Henderson's Fair, and it was in Liverpool, I think, at the time, the poster advertising the circus, and all the names were on it, Mr. Kite, Pablo Fanquez, and all the rest of it. And it's not clear which of the two or whether it was both of them, but they decided to write a song about it, which incidentally was banned, I think, by the BBC because they thought there were hidden references to heroin in it. But there you go, that's the story. So you can find Pablo Fanque in Wikipedia, but in more scholarly work as well, it's all documented.
Thank you very much, Lola, for that. Nicola, can I invite you to ask your question?
Yes, well, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me because I can't unmute myself. I think they can. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
I can't hear you.
I can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay, right. Well, I hope Lola and Yasmin that you can both hear me, because the first thing I want to say is that both of your speeches were absolutely brilliant. And I'm really, really glad that I was able to log on and to hear those today. A little fun fact for everybody. Years ago, about 20 years ago, Yasmin actually interviewed me. Yes, I know. I can't remember the paper. I think it was the Independent or the Guardian. I think it was after my book came out. I think it was that. But I just wanted to remind you of that. But a question to both of you, actually. I think you're absolutely right when you talk about, they say that history is written by the victors, and whoever it is controls the narrative. And in terms of whitewashing, and I'll use that term advisedly, Black people out of British history in the UK, that has been done to a quite frightening extent. But now that there is a recognition that we were actually here before Windrush, how do you deal with people who refuse at a fundamental level to accept this, particularly if they fall within one of these following three categories? A person in authority, a person in a leadership position, because I think that will affect the way that they perceive Black people. If they're a leader of a business or a senior person in the civil service, they will see Black people in a very different way if the historical narrative is corrected. So that group. A person of color, because sadly there are people of color, Black and brown people, who can't get their head around the fact that we have had those kind of roles in British history. And finally, history teachers. If a history teacher who's supposed to be teaching history doesn't fundamentally accept that there was a Black presence in Britain, or there's parts of Black history that aren't properly recorded, particularly with the curriculum that you can choose to teach certain things or not, how on earth do you deal with people who refuse at a fundamental level in those three areas to accept that? And that's a question for both of you.
I like that. 20 years will be a long time waiting. Yasmin, Can I invite you to respond first, and Lola next?
Nicola, it's so nice to see you, and I hope you're still writing and doing your law. I remember you were a lawyer and a novelist.
Yes.
I think leadership makes such a difference to all. Leadership is the umbrella under which we all live. If the leadership chooses to open its own mind up, then it's much easier to talk to the local history teacher or your friend or, whatever. My children say to me, you're always arguing with people. And it's true. I'm always caught up, whether it's dinner parties or buses, because I can't let go of this. Because every time these things are said, they multiply and they multiply. And the result is what's been happening to the Windrush generation. It's not just the history. Okay, and that's why that Sky Arts program was so important. Please watch it, because we're back where we were then. What you're hearing now is what we heard back then. And people were saying, we will send these Caribbeans back. Okay, and then you got the Windrush scandal. History is not just the narrative. It actually affects all of our lives. So if you look on what they say to me on Twitter, which is basically F off back where you came from, they do not know the reason I'm here is because they took my forebears from India to Africa to build the railways, then helped put Idi Amin into power because they thought he'd be their boy during the Cold War. And so we were expelled, so we ended up here, right? So I just feel I have to keep arguing with people about this, because ultimately they're questioning our right to be. And it's very unpleasant and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Yasmin. Lola,
Yeah, I would support everything that Yasmin has just said. I mean, it's a question that is really difficult to answer in many respects, because if people don't want to listen, then what can you do? I mean, you can't sort of inject them with the facts and the truth and what have you, particularly in this day and age where people are more likely to believing in some elaborate conspiracy than the actual truth that is staring them in the face. But I think for those So there's a level on which those who don't want to hear and will never want to hear, forget about them, because you're never going to persuade them. And then if you look at the sort of great mass of people who are in the middle of, in between the people who never want to hear anything and the people who do want to hear and want to read and get on with stuff. So there's this mass of people in the middle. So the theory goes that if you can convince maybe half of those people in the middle, again, you don't have to try and convince everybody, maybe half of those people in the middle, you can make some headway. So I think, you know, there's a group of people on which you give up. You're never going to persuade those people who are telling us to F off back where we came from, that, well, don't you know that we are here because you were there? That was the slogan we used to use. I'm sure Yasmin remembers that. We are here because you were there. And they don't want to know that. But for those who really are genuinely curious about this, we can do some work. I think with schools, yes, it was incredibly disappointing to hear that statement from the dispatch box about decolonizing the curriculum. Absolutely incredible in some respects, but then again, by the same token, not that surprising. So, but with schools, and I think with individual teachers and schools that know that there's something that they want to do but don't have the resources, I think one of the things that will come out of this particular phase of our history will be many more materials for schools, for scholars, for universities to use, that really does nail the legitimacy of the presence of these people here and what happened in our home countries.
Thank you, Lola, for that. I'm going to invite another speaker from our online community in a second. Just wanted to sort of just follow through, Lola, what you were saying. I mean, you're also a chancellor at a university, and I was looking, you know, I promised my co-host Sabu I won't mention any statistics or any figures, because he you know, nausea sort of sets in with him because he works with numbers all the time. 2018, 50% of the young people that went to Oxbridge came from 7 schools in this country. And 50%, the other 50% came from 24,000 state schools. And I'm just wondering, is Stormzy going to have some impact on this going forward? What do you think?
Oh my gosh, on each of these questions, you know, you could spend a few hours. So, you know, there are so many different levels to this question. And sometimes I think, you know, I'm all in favor of education. And, you know, basically I tell everybody to go out and, you know, study till they can study no more, do a PhD or whatever. But I mean, I think, you know, the reality of close to where I live, some of the people, some of those young men can barely read or write. So, you know, the first thing for these young people is to get them to love learning. And that's not going to happen overnight because, again, our education system isn't set up to do that. You know, you teach to the test, and if you've got kids who can't do well in those tests, then you shovel them off somewhere else to a pupil referral unit or something. But leaving that aside, you know, why is it down to Stormzy or Marcus Rashford or Raheem Sterling to kind of right the wrongs and injustices within our society? I mean, yes, it's great that they're doing that work, and it's great that they have a strong sense of social purpose and conscience. But it's not for them, in my view, it's not for them to try and, you know, mitigate these injustices and these wrongs that are being perpetuated in our education system and elsewhere. I mean, that statistic you said just now, obviously I knew there was something pretty askew in Oxbridge. And on one level, it wouldn't even matter so much if it wasn't for the fact that so many of those people that do come out of Oxbridge are responsible for running the country or running our major institutions, and the attitudes and beliefs and the lack of social diversity that they grow up with is then taken into those institutions and organizations and foisted on us. You know, and that's how, and so to me, it's such a skewed system that one or two individuals from Black or brown communities trying to do their best to make that work is not going to solve the problem. It's huge, it's systemic, and it needs to be addressed from government and from those educational institutions.
Indeed, and it's not lost on us that one of the products of Oxbridge, our current Prime Minister, has just been written to by 800 lawyers and former judges for an apology. The rest is yet to be seen in terms of Marcus Rashford, who's valiantly had already received a U-turn from the government and likely to receive the same this week on the children who are living in poverty across this country, across England in particular. On that note, can I invite, as our last questioner, before Rupert comes to give the vote of thanks, to Kulwant, please.
Hi. I just wanted to say, Yasmin and Lola, that this has been thoroughly enjoyable and we need more of this. I just wanted to mention that quite apart from enjoying it, I've identified obviously with a lot of what you've both said. And part of that is the fact that I've always considered myself black too, because growing up in this country, you were either black or you were white. I mean, obviously things have changed. And also leaning into the exhaustion of fighting and arguing with everybody. It seems that, you know, that's just the perpetual way of, you know, holding ground sometimes. But on that very note, I just wondered how, because I always feel that I'm constantly being referred to as the person that represents all black people. Of course I can't, it would be an impossibility. So given the level of arguing I have to do, or have done willingly rather, how have you dealt with the fact that you can't answer all those questions? You're not qualified.
Sorry, can I come back? And this is a really important. This is why I so admire Rennie at a lodge, because people of my generation probably, and your generation, you're much younger than me, because we were kind of influenced by the colonial relationship, I think internally felt obliged sometimes to behave and to do this job. Whereas I have so much faith in the younger generation. I mean, they're the ones who said roads should fall. When I was at Oxford, I did my postgraduate at Oxford. There were 3 of the most miserable years of my life, and I discouraged my children from ever applying to go there. Okay, and they now invite me to talk because I've been very upfront about how debilitating the place is for those of us who came from elsewhere. And, you know, it took these young people to have the courage to say, no, we don't care about the Rhodes Fellowship. I know he spent wonderful amounts of money on giving these fellowships to students, but this is what he was. Now, I remember hating that statue when I was there. I hated it, okay? But I never dared to say. So what is great is that the younger generation, of course, they're totally maligned. They're totally maligned in the press, by politicians, the woke generation, the menace, the cultural Marxists, you know, the abuse they're facing, but they're not stopping. It's like the environmental movement. They are the adults in this, I think. And it seems to me that now we don't have to do that work. I think I've often said, you know, and I'm married to somebody who was in the anti-racist movement. He's English. And often when these things come up, he answers. He answers because he says, you know what, it's our responsibility. It shouldn't be the responsibility of people like my wife to answer these questions. Everything's out there. Why haven't we accessed this information? But I think young people have changed the conversation. And I you know, to them, anti-racism is not, it's just instinctive now. And which is why they're being attacked so much. I've never seen this before. The young being attacked by the older generations in the way ours are, of all backgrounds, because when that statue was pulled down, there were all colors there together, right? And yet there's been this extraordinarily almost Maoist hit back against them. So I think, you just need to say, look, I've been doing this all my life. Somebody else needs to take up this job. Why don't you? That's what I do sometimes.
Thank you, Yasmin. Lola?
Yeah, it's a good question, and again, similar to Yasmin, although, and we must have a proper conversation, Yasmin, because there's so many layers to some of the things that you've said. But my feeling is that I keep thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to retire, and then I think no, and then other people say don't retire because there's still this work to be done. So I think part of my work to be done at the moment is to help to bring on and to nurture those young people, and to where it's necessary and where they desire it, to help them through understanding how different processes work, how different institutions work, how organizations work, how politics work, as much as I'm able to share that information and what I've learned, that's what I'm really happy to do. I think this thing about representation is a really difficult one as well, because again, I sort of think of another Stuart Hall phrase, the burden of representation. It's like, even if you don't actually say that, or if nobody says that you're a representative, you're still somehow, especially if you're the only Black person or brown person in an organization, you're seen as representing that group. And so if you do something wrong, or if something doesn't quite work out, it's the whole group takes the blame because you're there to represent them. And that's a very tough and lonely place to be. And I think particularly for those of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, that has been the norm, and to a large extent it still is. You walk into these rooms and you're the only person of colour around. So I think I always try to explicitly refuse that positioning as being the representative. Nobody's elected me or mandated me to do it. And also I try and call out some of those people amongst our communities who claim a representativeness in a way that I find really despicable, particularly when they're acting against the interests of their fellow Black people. So I think, it is quite a fraught position to be in when you are in a numerical minority. But again, to echo Yasmin and what other people have said, the crux of it is this allyship. People who will stand up and say, well, you're wrong, I'm calling you out. And you can't say, I'm calling you out because I've got a chip on my shoulder because I'm white, and that I'm calling you out because you're wrong. And I think that's really, really important.
Thank you very much, Lola and Yasmin, for your contribution. Kulwant, for your wonderful question. On this note, I'm going to invite Rupert Morris, the chairman of the National Liberal Club, to provide us with a word of thanks this evening. Rupert.
Thanks, Inderjeet. Thanks for putting this on. Thanks for getting two such wonderful speakers. I mean, you both said so many enlightening things. I noted down Lola talking about historical amnesia, and then various things that followed from that. And then I loved Yasmin quoting James Baldwin about people trapped in a history they don't understand. And then the last one of the things that just came out, it was you, Lola, saying this line, which I hadn't heard before, but which I love, which is, we're here because you were there. And I kind of feel that from the other direction, because as I was saying to Mihir Bose in the last political and economic circle discussion we had about colonialism, Mihir was talking about guilt and the past and history. And I'd been reading about the East India Club, the East India Company, and its role in Asia, India and China. And my family, their sort of wealth came from the East India Company. And so I know that I was there, my family were there, and you're here. And I'm just so thrilled you are here, because to me, you make life richer. I mean, I was watching Andrea Levy last night, whose book I loved reading, Small Island. You bring, diversity is something we celebrate here. You said you need allies, and the National Liberal Club, I swear, is an ally to you. We are, I think, at the moment, rediscovering some of our true spirit, some of the true ethos of the National Liberal Club. It's about diversity and tolerance. Yasmin, I think you will be pleased. I hope it won't be long before you come here, but you've been here, I dare say, and seen at the top of the stairs the portrait of Dadabhai Naoroji, seen by many as the founder of Indian nationalism and an inspiration to Gandhi. And we had a wonderful talk actually on Dadabhai Naoroji here. So we're getting much more in touch. Dadabhai Naoroji was this first Asian MP who was a member of the National Liberal Club in 1880s, 1890s. And we celebrate him. Lola, I would like to show you, if you haven't already seen it, the portrait of Charles Bradlaugh, white man, but a man who will be dear to your heart because I know you're involved with the National Secular Society and I'm a humanist. So he's a favoured hero of both of ours. So there's a lot for you here. We celebrate diversity here at the National Liberal Club. We don't take these things for granted. I think it's terribly important hearing what you've had to say this evening. It feels really important to me. And I'm thrilled that the young are embracing it. The young are among your allies as well. And I was very proud when one of my grandsons was on the Black Lives Matter march, young white chap, 17, on a Black Lives Matter march. I thought, great, you've got it. These things matter. We need to learn. I mean, I need to learn. I was like you, Lola, but from a different point of view. I was brought up to think it was great in the kind of 19th century when half the world was pink. But there's so much that went on beneath that. And I think we've seen this. I think Brexit for me and for a lot of us here at the National Liberal Club had a lot to do with white people in England being trapped in a history they didn't understand and voting Brexit out of some sort of blind fury. I think we can do better at the National Liberal Club. I hope we can do better as a nation. And thank you, both of you, for being very inspiring tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rupert, with those kind words. Can I also add, Yasmin, you mentioned history is important. In your backyard, you will know the name of Blair Peach, Gurdeep Singh Nijhar, and Winston Silcott in terms of the Broadwater Farm estate, what happened there. I think I was at university when we made Winston Silcott president of our NUS and brought it to the fore, and we won that battle. And last year, we commemorated the 40 years of the resistance of the Southall community against the National Front, when sadly Blair Peach, a white New Zealand teacher, was murdered, clobbered to death by the police, and yet we have no accountability. And 42 years before, Gurdeep Singh Nijhar was murdered by the National Front on the streets of Southall. Again, people were caught but never dealt with as they should have been at the time. So this is fresh history that exercises me and shaped me for who I am today because of the backyard, what happened to us and the police brutality.
Can I just say, I was at that march when Blair Peach was killed.
Wow.
I was on that demonstration and we had to hide in some stranger's house, and he was Sikh and he hid us for 8 hours because the police were all roaming looking for us. So I was there.
Wow.
You were one of the thousands who came, who heeded our call. I think you were part of the community, very far from us. I was not even in my teenage years at the time. Looked after by my mamaji, which is my maternal uncle, during what happened on those streets, and we were able to run off because we knew the back streets and the alleyways, and the police who were brought in didn't have a clue what was going on with the territorial support group at the time. Anyway, enough of reminiscing this evening. I think Nicola has got a lot of catch up to do with you, Yasmin and Lola, going forward. All I wanted to say was it's been a wonderful evening, and thank you very much for making this a wonderful success. Those of you who've joined us online from various places across the globe and also the UK, and people who have made the effort to come into the club and deal with the COVID restrictions that we're facing as members at the minute. And our doors are wide open for both you, Yasmin and Lola. Anytime you want to come over, I will treat you to either a lunch or a dinner, with Rupert in attendance if he's able to join us. So when the restrictions are a bit easier, probably in the new year. So please, the doors of the club are always open to you both. All you need to do is ask. The final thing I would say in ending this evening is that the next event, the Political Economic Circle, is scheduled to run is on the 23rd of November, same time, with 4 of the largest union leaders in the country, Len McCluskey of Unite the Union, Mary Bounstead of the National Education Union, Apple and TSSA. They'll be joining me for a wide and varied discussion around the pandemic and how it's impacted our lives, and particularly the workforce that they represent as their members. So please do join us then. And can I take this opportunity on behalf of the club to thank our speakers who have been wonderful in inspiring us this evening. And I've got lots of messages coming through on Zoom, which I will share with you afterwards, Yasmin and Lola. And thank you from the bottom of our hearts for making this a wonderful success. And I'm grateful to you.